I'm Mabel Garrison. I'm the director of the Institute for European Studies here at Cornell. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Geneviève Zubrzycki here to speak to us today. Professor Zubrzycki has had a distinguished career studying and specifying the connections between religion and national identity. She is one of the pioneers in comparative historical sociology and the melding of the political and the cultural as well as the religious aspects of social life. Professor Zubrzycki is a professor at the University of Michigan. She quite amazingly directs 3 centers there: the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, the Center for European Studies, as well as the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. She's also the editor of the Comparative Studies in Society and History Journal, a very prestigious journal in history and politics and comparative social sciences more generally. She has written an amazing amount of books in her relatively short time as a scholar. She has written relatively short time. I want to say like her 50-year career, but and although I usually don't do show and tell, I just happen to have had them all in my office, so I decided to bring them. Her first book is The Crosses of Auschwitz: Nationalism and Religion in Post-Communist Poland. Her second book is Beheading the Saint. It's titled Nationalism, Religion, and Secularism in Quebec. And she's coming here today to talk to us about Resurrecting the Jew, Nationalism, Philosemitism, and Poland's Jewish Revival. All of these books have been heavily commented on, heavily reviewed, and she's won numerous prizes for them. She's also written more articles than I can give you a sense of. And one, I don't exactly remember the title, but I do remember reading it and had a very interesting take on the role of Polish vodka in national identity. I remember. So, at any rate, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Zubrzycki to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Mabel, for this very generous and detailed introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at Cornell. It's my first time at Cornell. So I had the tour yesterday and was really impressed by the beauty of campus and the area. Reminded me a bit of home. I'm from Quebec City. So the landscape, resonates with home, actually. And today I will be speaking about my new book, Resurrecting the Jew, Nationalism, Philosemitism, and Poland's Jewish Revival. And the title is provocative, right? Resurrecting the Jew, the word the Jew, and we've had debate about this if you watch SNL recently, and about the Jews and the Jew, and what I mean by resurrecting the Jew is the resurrection of Jewish culture in Poland that's primarily enacted by non-Jewish Poles. And that was that's the puzzle. Why do non-Jews in Poland care so much today about Jewish culture? What does it mean to them? What does Jewishness as a category and as a symbol signify for non-Jews? And because I use the term resurrecting, because it is in this active voice, so because it's an active process, there's agency involved in people doing that resurrection, but also because it is a phenomenon that's primarily driven by Christian. It is a Polish Catholic phenomenon. And that's, to me, a very important question about what is at the source of that phenomenon. And that's what I'm going to be trying today to give you, a glimpse of what the book is about. The book is also about the renewal of Jewish communal life in Poland since the fall of communism. And that's what I call these two phenomena, these two strands: the resurrection of Jewish culture by non-Jews and the renewal of Jewish communal life after the fall of communism together constitute what I call the Jewish turn in Poland. In this talk, I will primarily focus on non-Jews doing that cultural work. But in the book, I talk about both, and I talk about how they're parallel lines, processes, different processes, but how they intersect and how they sometimes reinforce each other. So first, I'll give you background, basically, I'll set the stage for that phenomenon. So what Poland is and should be has been at the center of public debates and political fights since the fall of communism in Poland in 1989. And Polish society has become even more divided with the rise of far-right populism in recent years. So one faction favors a traditional vision of Polish identity crystallized around Catholicism, conservative family values, and a national narrative that emphasizes Polish martyrdom and heroism. Another faction promotes progressive values and secularism and questions key tenets of Polish national mythology. And in that contest over Poland and Polishness, history and memory occupy center stage, and no other aspect of Polish history has been more debated, more disputed than that of Polish-Jewish relations. In the past 2 decades, Poles have engaged in a divisive debate about the participation of ethnic Poles in violent crimes against Polish Jews before, during, and after the Holocaust, after the Second World War. And that difficult process of soul searching and reckoning with the past is described by the far right as anti-Polish defamation, which the current government led by the Law and Justice Party attempts to stop. At the same time, since 1989, Poland's small Jewish community has undergone a significant renaissance, and a substantial number of institutions, non-Jewish public figures, memory activists, and ordinary citizens are engaged in a multifaceted resurrection of Jewish culture. And I want to give you an idea of that interest. So there are over 40 festivals of Jewish culture held annually in almost as many Polish cities and towns. So you can see the geographic spread. The red, so the size of the festival is reflected in the size of circles. The red circles are festivals that have been ongoing for several years. The blue ones are punctual ones that appeared but then disappeared, and the yellow ones were relatively recent ones. In the book, I have 4 maps that shows basically the growth of Jewish festivals since 1988. But Klezmer music, Jewish style cafes and restaurants are also very popular. Here you have the recreation of a Jewish street in Krakow's Jewish neighborhood, Kazimierz. You also have a mix of Ashkenazi and Israeli culture. That's also something that's interesting. You have bookstores also that have increased open throughout the years and in different Polish cities. The past decade has also witnessed the inauguration of several new museums, memorials, and memory spaces. So the most famous one, the most important one, is the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, but you also have Galica Museum in Krakow. You have Schindler's Factory Museum also in Krakow. In Krakow also you have the ghetto's Eagle Pharmacy. You have other former Stadtlach that have opened, renovated synagogues and open museums in those. So a lot of mnemonic activity around Poland's Jewish past. When I'm talking about memory spaces, I'm talking about official initiatives. So this is, for example, the pathway that shows where the ghetto, the Warsaw ghetto was, that was completely destroyed. So in order to grasp where it was, and also get an idea of the size of the ghetto. Now there's a path like this all over Warsaw. It crosses sometimes buildings, it crosses parks that have been built over that. You also have more ephemeral memory spaces that were created. So this is Próżna Street in Warsaw that was decrepit, the only standing block from the former Warsaw ghetto. And at one point, it was a call from a Jewish organization to send pictures from Polish Jews from all over the world. And there's like several thousand that were collected. And before those buildings were renovated, there were an exhibit on the building themselves of not former inhabitants, but of Polish Jews living there. And now that exhibit is gone because the buildings have been renovated. But there's a lot of memory spaces like these that really dot the entire Polish landscape that I document in one chapter in particular. And you've also had the engagement of artists and public intellectuals with Poland's Jewish past and Polish-Jewish relations, as well as the development and of Jewish and Holocaust studies program in many Polish universities. And to give you just an idea of that interest, academic interest, between 2011 and 2021, so over 10 years, approximately 100 books and several hundred academic articles on Jewish topics were published on average every year. And many of them were actually written to be accessible for the greater public. So 100 academic books published every year on average in the last decade on Jewish topics. So this is something that, yes, there's like Klezmer clubs and, cafes and hip, places where Poles can consume Jewish culture in a very casual way, but there's also a significant engagement in academic production and also in institutions that are there with public dimension, such as museums. A last indicator of the Jewish turn, for which there are no official statistics, but I have data still on that based on what rabbis have disclosed to me. There's a modest but steady number of conversions to Judaism, many from people who discover that they have Jewish ancestry and they want to return to the source. Many of them don't have papers that show their lineage, and they have to undergo a formal conversion process, so they do that. And there's other from Poles who have absolutely no connection, no family connection to Judaism, and who undergo also that process of conversion. So this is a multifaceted phenomenon that can be observed in a variety of social spaces. And then you might, if you know Central Europe or Eastern Europe, you might wonder, okay, so how is that different from a Jewish revival in Germany or in Hungary? So just to open a brief parenthesis, so in Germany, the process was primarily initiated in the 1980s by converts, but the arrival of Soviet Jews after the collapse of the Soviet Union really invigorated the Jewish community in Germany. And then you had Israelis also arriving in Germany that really kind of solidified also the revival, that Jewish revival. In Hungary, the process is also conducted, like in Poland, by non-Jews and Jews, but primarily by Jews, and primarily by Jews in Budapest. So there's a concentration in Budapest, and Budapest has about a dozen synagogues, active synagogues, was not destroyed like Warsaw, for example. It's closer to Krakow in terms of having material heritage that people can kind of work with. And so Poland is very different because while Poland had the largest Jewish population in the world before the Second World War, Warsaw was the largest Jewish city in the world with about 400,000 Jewish citizens of Warsaw. After the war, or during the Holocaust, 90% of Polish Jewry was exterminated. the borders of Poland shifted west, which means that eastern regions, Galicia, for example, where there were a lot of Jews, were incorporated in Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian Soviet republics. Jews from the west who survived became part of Germany. The few survivors that returned, so some of them were victims to anti-Semitic violence, pogroms in Kielce in 46, another pogrom in Krakow, and many basically decided to leave. That left a very small Jewish community that was weakened by communism, and it was also weakened in 1968 with an anti-Semitic purge where an additional 20,000 Polish Jews were expelled from Poland, which means that today in Poland, there are between, and then estimates vary a great deal depending on how you count or how you attribute Jewishness to someone, but between 7,000 and 40,000. The numbers would be closer to 7,000 and 13,000 Jews if you accept the definition of what counts as core Judaism. So basically, if someone is qualified for the law of return to Israel, so that would be between 7,000 and 13,000. So Jewish activists say, some of them, that there's as many as 100,000 Poles who have Jewish origin, so there's potential for communal growth. Whether you say 7, 13, 20, or 100, it's clear that this is a tiny, tiny community. It's a community, however, that's very active, and Jewishness as a trope, and Jews and the Jew as a symbol occupies a very large space in Polish social imagination. So one might be tempted, non-Jews interested in all things Jewish, to think that the Jewish term is simply anti-Semitism, or to reduce the phenomenon to a reaction to Poland's rightward turn, to a counter movement. But this interpretation is empirically wrong simply because the beginnings of the Jewish revival precedes Poland's sharp turn to the right. So how can we make sense of that phenomenon? So to be sure, the Jewish term must be read in relation to the end of communism. So Jewishness under communism was rarely discussed. People who knew about their origins did not talk about them much, to the extent that second post-Holocaust generation and third post-Holocaust generation did not know that they had Jewish roots. So this changed after 1989 when people can start, there's several taboos that are lifted, and thank you, I don't need it now. So.
Sorry about that.
1989 changes that. People can dig in their family's past and then decide to engage with the Jewishness of their family or part of the family. You also had the opening of the Eastern Bloc that made institutional support and funding available for the renewal of Jewish communal life. And also the opening of the Eastern Bloc facilitated the development of Holocaust tourism, which in turn participated in an ongoing gentrification of formerly neglected Jewish neighborhoods and sites. That's especially true in Krakow, which is only an hour from Auschwitz, for example. And with the opening of the West, it brought Poles in contact with a different narrative of World War II than the one they had been socialized under communism, namely, the important role of the Holocaust in the history of World War II. And this led to a narrative shock in Poles who had been for 50 years taught and socialized into a narrative in which they constituted the main martyrs of World War II, and they were also the main heroes. So one thing that happens is the reconfiguration of the history of the Second World War, but also of the commemorative practices. I didn't talk about that, but also the publication in 2001 of Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, which describes in painful details how ethnic Poles tortured and murdered their Jewish neighbors in a small town in northeastern Poland in Jedwabne. And this is really causing a major debate in Polish society that was no longer just a debate between academics, but this is people talking about this on radio talk shows, in schools, at museums, at workplace and buses. I was there when the book came out, and everyone was talking about this, and every housewife had a book, and people were basically passing that book around. And that's where the debate and this issue of defamation of Polishness around Polish Jewish issues really start, and that Poles become clearly divided, with one faction that decides to basically bury that and reorient narratives around other issues, and another faction that decides that they want to really examine this, both academically, but also culturally. So that's a specific historical context in which the revival is taking place. Also, Poland's accession to the EU that makes additional funding for all sorts of cultural initiatives possible. But I'm arguing in the book that there's also something more that's going on. And what I'm doing for the book is to consider macro, meso, and micro dimensions of Philosemitism. And Philosemitism that I define as non-Jews support of and even identification with Jews. So on the basis of archival and ethnographic research in multiple Polish cities and towns, I analyzed Polish-centered, Jewish-centered initiatives sponsored by state institutions and NGOs, bottom-up civic projects, and everyday individual practices. That strategy provided me with a view of the production of the Jewish cultural revival, as well as its consumption and recreation by its participants. And my research shows that non-Jewish cultural elites, social activists, ordinary citizens, and some state agencies' memory work is part of a broader attempt to expand the symbolic boundaries of Polishness. It's a way to articulate a civic national project and build pluralism in a mono-ethnic and monocultural country. So 95% of Poland's population is ethnically Polish, and about 92–93% is Catholic, at least nominally Catholic. So how do you build multiculturalism in a place where everyone is Polish and Catholic? So one of my arguments is that you resurrect Jewish culture. You also, Poles have not been, until the war in Ukraine, have not been receptive to accepting any refugees, either the Syrians during the Syrian war, or at the border of Belarus, other migrants that were, last fall and still now are waiting to come. So with what can you build a modern polity, especially since when we talk of modern states, they are multicultural, and multiculturalism is a key value of modern civic state and of the EU. But why Jews? So a few reasons. So one is because Jewishness is an ethno-religious category that has traditionally been perceived by Poles as the polar opposite of the Polak Catholic. Another reason is that Western style capitalism, socialism, and cosmopolitanism are specifically associated with Jewishness. So if Jewishness is a symbol standing for these values, capitalism, socialism, cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, Poland is said by the right to be ruled by Jews, by symbolic Jews, who must be neutralized. Hence the anti-Semitism in a country with very few Jews. But the logic of this magical anti-Semitism, which is a term that former dissident Adam Michnik names, is also at the origin of magical philo-Semitism. Because if ethno-religious nationalists contend that Jews are contaminating the nation with liberal ideas, building a pernicious post-national cosmopolitan world, and must therefore be politically marginalized, Jews must for the same reason be rescued and Jewishness promoted according to proponents of a civic vision of the polity. So you have liberal youth who wear t-shirts, brandish posters, or wear kippahs like this non-Jew in protest against Catholic nationalists, subversively claiming that they are Jews. A 40-year-old lawyer living in Warsaw explained that wearing specific Jewish brands is like taking part in the public discussion about Jews in Poland, that Jews live here and can live here. And that's an important comment. Just like here, Tomasz Sztaba, who's wearing a kippah, and the Jewish owner of that business that produces Jewish sweatshirts is saying, a huge fan of Jewish culture, famous among his friends for wearing kippah, to share a statement that being a Jew in Warsaw is cool and safe. And she is the owner, very supportive of that. So this is not something that we would encounter in the US and think this is great. We would, but there, Jews think that this is actually very good. It's a form of performative solidarity that is seen very, very positively by Jews themselves. And my interviews with key cultural entrepreneurs and numerous non-Jewish activists shows that their promotion of Jewish culture is part of a broader attempt to counter the monopoly of the Catholic right over the definition of Polishness and expand what it means to be Polish. So let's listen to Janusz Maku, who is the co-founder of the famous Krakow Festival of Jewish Culture. He told me in one of our conversations, Krakow was always a multicultural place where cultural pluralism was often very obvious. Today's national monotheism, religious monotheism that was created after the Second World War is scorching me. It's hurting me. I really don't like this. So let's go back here to what is the basis of our spirituality, actually, since Jews were Polish citizens. So he's using Jewish culture and the Jewish past in a way to articulate a civic vision of the nation, a community of citizens based on Jewish culture to counter this cultural monotheism. That comment is significant as it shows how one of the key actors of the resurrection of Jewish culture in Poland grounds that cultural enterprise in a political project, that of expanding notions of Polishness, but more importantly, and radically to shift the idiom of nationhood from an ethnic community to a community of citizens. Consider also Anya, a non-Jewish 30-something art historian who dances in a Jewish dance troupe, constituted by non-Jews. On the one hand, Jewish culture is, let's say, Oriental. But on the other hand, because it developed in Poland, in spite of everything, it's somehow very much tied to Poland, yes? It's kind of an exotic element in an environment. It's not something like Swahili somewhere far in Africa, but rather something that's different from Polish culture, yet at the same time related to it, inseparable from it even. Now, Anya is from Silesia, which is a borderland between Germany and the Czech Republic and Poland. And when I ask her, she tells me this, and I ask her, oh, so do you speak Silesian? She looks at me like I was a mad person saying, no, my grandmother is still, but why would I speak that dialect? But she was learning Yiddish. So that's interesting to me. Why would you not favor, for example, other minorities that exist and persist? Well, they don't have cultural capital. Somehow Jewishness has a cultural capital that is worth it for, non-Jews to acquire, so that she would respond to disdain about the Silesian dialect, but was really keen on learning Yiddish and not understanding why I would even ask that question. So to me, that was very telling. A third reason why expansions of national identity are articulated around Jews and Jewish culture is that Jews, unlike Ukrainians, who are very close to Poles, or the Vietnamese, the largest visible minority in Warsaw, who are obviously very different. So Jews are both exotic and somewhat indigenous. like Anya is saying here. They're different enough, yet were nourished from the Polish soil and grew on these lands, as another interviewee told me. So Jewishness is both other and ours, which were comments made spontaneous by countless interviewees. They are the perfect indigenous other. They are mostly also absent. So it's safer to build multiculturalism with a minority that's very small than to import or accept visible minorities with, with all that the issues that are brought with it. And they're constantly saying, like, we don't want to be a new France and a new Germany with all the kind of problems, or UK, that it brings with it. This indigenization of a multicultural Poland is very important because civic discourses can be perceived as remnant of communist party state rhetoric and or as an import from the European Union and imposition from neoliberal Polish elites. So progressive civic nationalists must work twice as hard to make their vision of the nation legitimate and authentically Polish. So they try to promote that civic vision of Poland by reconstructing a narrative, for example, that emphasizes the religious tolerance of Poland in the 16th century, the First Republic's multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state, to Poland's elective monarchy and its the first constitution of Europe in 1791, to the interwar liberal traditions, or to a certain extent also to Solidarity's peaceful activism in the 1980s. But because the right is also using some of those tropes, there is very little left that they can grasp as their own. And Poland's Jewish past offers, a plethora of a very rich repertoire of stories, but also of cultural, if not artifacts, elements. So Ula, another interviewee, explained to me that she wanted to learn about Jews and Jewish culture to better know herself as a Pole. So I don't have her quotes. I'm just going to listen here instead of reading. Well, basically, there's been a Jewish presence in our country, u nas, for 800 years on our land, here in Poland. So there's an influence that we don't remember anymore because there are almost no Jews left in Poland. But it's important to know that culture so that we can better know ourselves, our identity, who we are. So paradoxically then, ethnicity and religion remains a category through which civic nationalists attempt to transcend ethno-religious nationalism. And that conundrum is at the basis of what I call the tragedy of Polish civic nationalism. So that to escape ethnic nationalism, ethnic nationalists have to resort to the very category that they're trying to erase. So Jewish culture becomes a means through which Poles reinvent themselves. And here's Maku again. So whether people know it or not, it is a fact that Jews for many, many centuries made tremendous contributions to Polish culture. So when we're talking about Polish culture, we're equally talking about Jewish culture. Without contributions of Jews, true Polish culture could not exist. What I'm trying to do is to help Poles realize what is theirs. And that these last words, are problematic. What is theirs? And so in the book, I'm trying to tackle this issue of cultural appropriation and whether it works in the Polish context and what tools we can use. So I find that the concept is perhaps not the best, the concept of cultural appropriation, not only because it lumps together a wide area of practices with different meanings, but because it is a normative term rather than a concept or a heuristic device. So I think that we need finer instruments, and I developed a typology of registers of engagement with the culture of the others that allows us to analyze the different practices. Oh, see, that's what happens. Okay, so casual engagement. So that denotes occasional consumption of Jewish cultural product, and that's probably the most common form of engagement with Jewish culture. You also have kosher vodka, since we're talking about vodka. So that's very interesting because it's rumored to be pure. It's difficult to be purer than vodka. Vodka is distilled. But kosher vodka, there's also kind of magical thinking, is rumored to be even pure because kosher, and therefore to prevent hangovers. So it's also more expensive, and people go for the kosher brand. So romantic engagement. So if you read here, that was a project of this gentleman here who would write graffiti throughout Poland, "I miss you, Jew." And people really participate in this, and there's a website where people would post testimonies, but you see that it's a romantic vision. I miss you in the small Polish towns and cities, etc. And I term that kind of engagement romantic Philosemitism. So it's characterized by an uncritical, nostalgic view of Jewish culture in Poland's multicultural past. And it's problematic insofar as it conceals a complex dynamic of ethnic and religious hierarchies that existed, discrimination and power struggles, common to stratified communities of all sizes, and which in Polish society place ethnic Poles Catholics at the top and Jews at the bottom. Political engagement or performative solidarity, as you see there, is less common but more visible, as in the cases of non-Jews wearing kippas, yellow paper daffodil stars on their lapels as a commemorative practice, or clothing with Jewish slogans in order to express commemorative solidarity or to make political statements in the public sphere. So it's more rare, but more visible. Critical introspective engagement involves deep reflection on blind spots regarding past and present Polish-Jewish relations and Jewish issues more broadly. It is most common in those with a high level of commitment to Jewish-related institutions and processes, like studying Jewish history, researching Polish-Jewish relations, working in a Jewish museum, or volunteering in Jewish or Jewish-related institutions. So there's a lot of institutions that do very important work uncovering the Jewish past in Poland. So that's one register. And the other one is empathetic engagement. And here I did a lot of field work at Krakow's JCC, which is, as its director likes to say, the only JCC where there's no pool and a very active community. So it's not a sports center, it's a cultural center. And it's staffed by non-Jews, a large number of which are volunteers, and they're staying on for several years. So I interviewed about 30 or 40 of these people, mostly young women. And that is an interesting group. Why do they volunteer? What are the motivations for them? So they display a type of engagement they feel a personal connection with the Jewish past and the current revival, whether through family history, personal relationships, or individual commitments. And they express this commitment through their lifestyle choices and acts. So empathetic engagement is both a form of alliance with Jews and a form of resistance to the dominant ethno-Catholic vision of Polishness. Even though most of them are Catholic, sometimes there's one or two Protestants, most of them are Catholic, many of them are practicing Catholics, but they're practicing Catholics in the more liberal wings of the Catholic Church. So these registers, and then of course, the crude cultural appropriation. And this is a shocking image. So this is in the small town of Chmielnik, between Krakow and Kielce. where a young man was doing, providing entertainment dressed up as an Orthodox Jew. The other picture is even more shocking, where mothers are taking pictures of their children, putting their faces in that. So it provided a form of entertainment. This was the only place where I witnessed anything of that sort in Poland, and I've traveled extensively at festivals like this. What's even more puzzling than this is the fact that this was entertainment that was provided at a festival created by a very liberal mayor, an activist who had renovated the synagogue and created a museum in the synagogue, and did not see the tension between having, a museum and all sorts of educational things for teenagers, for example, Polish-Jewish relations, and having something like that. So I discuss also that in greater detail in the book. So these registers of engagement with the culture of the other can be placed on a continuum. What divides them is their non-reflective or their reflective character, whether people are thinking about this. And you can move from one to another. So you could engage, for example, in casual engagement. Going to the Poli Museum, for example, does not involve much of an investment, but being really challenged by what you see and then wanting to become, more educated on that, and then eventually moving to performative solidarity, for example, or a more critical introspective. You could have a romantic form of Philosemitism and a casual, and you can move. What you don't see is crude, really, and critical introspective within the same individuals, although it can happen in a broader public field. So the typology serves less to classify specific practices and to provide an interpretive framework for analyzing them. It seeks to avoid dismissing a wide range of Jewish-related activities by non-Jewish Poles as yet another case of undifferentiated cultural appropriation. Yet it is clearly the discourse and practices in reflective registers of engagement that serve to deconstruct Polishness and reconstruct it along new lines. So we should therefore pause to ask whether the resurrection of Jewish culture in Poland by non-Jews reaches enough audiences and provokes sufficient critical insight into notions of Polishness to spur significant change. So, to conclude, what does the case of Poland's Jewish turn teach us? So, briefly, my work shows that the ways and the extent to which dominant modes of imagining the nation shape not only formal rules of membership, such as citizenship, but also shape symbolic membership to the national community. So that the nation is generally imagined in ethnic terms in Poland and in Central Eastern Europe more generally, explains why non-ethnically Polish residents and citizens may never fully belong. It also explains why some members of the dominant ethno-national group are symbolically excluded from the national community for their political leanings, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, or gender identity by being ethnicized, by being turned into Jews. So in Poland, if you're not defending an ethno-Catholic vision of the nation, you are discursively turned into a Jew. You're accused of being a Jew, you're labeled a Jew, so that feminist terrorists, as they are called right now in Poland, are very often accused of being crypto-Jews, people who basically converted to Catholicism, etc. And this is helpful to think about other cases. So consider France, for example, which is the paradigmatic case of civic nationhood, where inclusion into the national community is premised upon one's adherence to the social contract, not blood. So how can the French right symbolically exclude ethnic and racial minorities when ethnicity and race is not even supposed to exist in France? So they do so by ideologizing those racial minorities. You turn Arabs, for example, into dangerous Muslims that threaten the Republic by infringing upon secularism, a sacred tenet of the social contract. So this is the process. So in the ethnic nation of Poland, you turn your ideological opponent, you racialize that opponent, you turn that person into a Jew. In what you do in the US as well, you turn racial and ethnic others, basically, into ideological threats. Or, you know, we say, oh, well, Obama, for example, it was not accused of you know, being black, but oh, he's not a citizen because he was not born on US soil. Or socialism is anti-American. So basically, you also use these categories. You are constrained by the categories of the dominant form of national identity. My work also highlights that regardless of how progressive a national project may be, there remains a problematic tension in expanding the symbolic boundaries of the nation through the other, as that other, whether real or symbolic, remains malleable at the hands of those who control the category. The symbolic power exerted, quote, to articulate the principles of vision and division, unquote, and that's a quote from Pierre Bourdieu, is therefore still violent, even when it is used to expand boundaries of the group, even when it's used to, you know, for progressive projects. So considering the motivations of individuals engaging with the culture of other groups and the personal meaning those practices have for them, nevertheless, remains essential if we are to gain any understanding of phenomena like philosemitism, performative solidarity, or cultural appropriation. The identification of different registers of engagement with the culture of the other should be helpful in studying cultural appropriation in different contexts. And I will stop here so that we can discuss.
Well, thank you for that absolutely fascinating talk. And we already have 4 questions in the in the queue here. We have quite a virtual audience actually, and we have a large audience in the room. So what I think I'll do is let me line up questions in the room. I'll get about 4. Let me get hands up to get a sense of how many people want to begin asking questions in the room. And then I'll see if I can integrate them with some of the questions we have on the screen. So are there any questions in the room?
There's one student in the back.
Where is it? Okay, and I'm sorry, I didn't know your name.
Howard.
Howard, okay. And I know your name, and okay, and as a student.
He was first.
He was first, okay. What is your name?
Chris.
Chris, okay. And then I see Leela, okay. All right, so I have 4. Why don't we hear what they are, because they might integrate with some of the ones we have on the screen. So Chris, why don't you begin?
Sure. So my name is Chris. I'm a freshman here. This lecture very much reminds me of the African American position of American culture. As we know, like white Americans, they consume and appropriate African American music in terms of rap and hip hop, slang, fashion, sports, and so on. But this doesn't mean that racism ceases to exist, right? What parallels do you see within Jews in Poland or Judaism in Poland, right, as like an other, and Blackness in America?
Can I just, does anybody of the other 3 people have a question that articulates with that one?
No.
Okay, then why don't you answer that? Because it doesn't articulate exactly what I have on the screen either.
I mean, so that's a very good question. A main difference is that there's a large number of African Americans, so real people who can also kind of push back against all forms of cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation, though, is not just hip hop. So, what is cultural appropriation of hip hop? It would be to consume, probably not, because people consume. That's what people who sell music want. Right, so maybe then it's Eminem or like all the white hip hop people, right? And actually the movie, was it 8 Mile?
Yeah.
Was about that, and it's about class and race. Cultural appropriation comes in when what is appropriated is either demeaned, mocked, or is appropriated by people who can use it in the public sphere while the members of the communities themselves cannot, right? So that's Kim Kardashian getting a little tanner or doing, braiding in ways that are not considered appropriate for African-American women to wear in the workplace. That becomes like the point of tension. But I think that it's a good, what I think is interesting with what I'm proposing is just to force us to think about what is cultural appropriation and when does it become an instrument, when does it also kind of reproduce anti-Semitism in the case of Poland, right? So when does it become anti-Semitism? Why? When is it not? When I would, every time I would present before I wrote the book, I would have people who would say, well, that's a case of cultural appropriation. I would go back to Poland, and in my interviews with Jews, and rabbis and a lot of leaders, I would ask, so how do you react to this? And they were all telling me the same thing and continue to tell me the same thing. It's much more important for them in Poland now to have people listening to Klezmer music, to have non-Jews playing cultural, Klezmer music, even wearing kippah in the public sphere, than not. Because then it brings them, it gives the Jewish community a presence in the public sphere that they cannot necessarily have themselves. And he says, okay, so once in a while you see someone coming to the synagogue, we give them a kippah, and we tell them that's a sign of respect, etc. And then they leave and they walk around the neighborhood still with a kippah. What were they learning? And the chief rabbi of Poland, who's American, would relate this to his experience as an American in the 1970s, wanting to learn more about Native American culture and going to a sweat lodge, etc. So what was that? Cultural appropriation. How can you get to learn about the other if you cannot engage with their culture? So for the Jewish community, it is to a certain extent a positive development because there's openness about the Polish past, the Jewish past of Poland, even though they might be critical of certain practices. So they're critical of Christian evangelicals celebrating Jewish holidays. They say, well, they shouldn't call it Jewish. It's not a Seder. I mean, there's nothing Jewish about what they're doing, right? Except that they call it Jewish. I don't know if that answers that question, but I mean, it is related to, these questions are very difficult. And what's difficult too is that these cultural forms are being, if not appropriated, but adopted by descendants of the very people who, were violent against those minorities. And that's also the problem.
I have lots of people now coming up on the screen. So Howard, and I'm going to try to group questions. What is your question?
Do you have any sense that the non-Jewish Poles see this as sort of an economic boom, like it increases tourism from the rest, Jewish tourism from the rest of the world?
Does anybody have a question in the room that's like, that's a companion question?
And then I have just a comment. Somebody wrote a book recently, People Love Dead Jews. And it sort of sounds very much like this.
Okay, either you, I now have Christina and Leah, and your question is not. All right, there is a companion question online. It says, what is to be gained by ethnic Poles by embracing Judaism? So I think those two.
Well, so the gain, so you could think, yes, that there's some economic gain in opening a Jewish cafe. Many of those are Jewish owned, actually, and they're Jewish owned by American Jews and Israelis. So I'm not sure they're gaining that much. I mean, okay, the Festival of Jewish Culture, that's probably the largest Jewish enterprise or Jewish-related enterprise owned by non-Jews, but it's also a nonprofit. So, I mean, they're not gaining that much out of that. I don't think that the economics, we're not talking about huge numbers, right? And those festivals, they're primarily people, they're free events. So people go to those festivals, they're funded by the government, they're funded by private sponsors, they're funded by, NGOs, etc. I wouldn't think, even Klezmer is popular. I mean, it's not like hip hop, right? Klezmer musicians are not making tons of money from that.
I was really thinking more about tourism, like drawing in tourists to see, like I have a friend who just went to see where his family's little town
So,
is.
okay, so that I would say, and the man in Khmelnyk who organized that festival and renovated, was responsible for, renovating that synagogue, and I quote him in the book. He tells me, well, some places have a castle or a lake, we have a synagogue. So, I mean, that's renovating that synagogue. It's also part of basically kind of getting people, encouraging tourism, but the tourism is not that huge either.
I want to get to Christina and you, Christina.
Thank you so much for this. I had a question about the origins of this wave of Philosemitism. And as soon as I heard you speaking about this, I remembered that little essay by Milan Kundera, The Tragedy of Central Europe, that has a section in it in which Kundera all of a sudden waxes nostalgic about the Jewish population that distinguished Central Europe from Russia. And for him, it became basically an argument about why we belong to the West, why we're European and should not be abandoned by the arms of Russia, which is Soviet Union. So did this also come as a...
So that's in the 1980s?
Yeah, so this is basically something much later that they're using to differentiate themselves from a certain vision of ethnic or Catholic, right, Polish identity, and does it have any connection with that attempt to grapple with Russia, right, and communism and that legacy? No.
I mean, it does have, it's about Polish discussions about their role in the Holocaust. That's clearly, it really, I don't have this slide here. I don't think so. Let me see. No, but let's see, that's a Christian Seder. In a different presentation, I showed like the rise of festival. It's 2001 is really when it starts. There's a before and after Jan Gross's book in Poland. There's no question. There were discussions in the 80s after Landsman's film Shoah that was shown on Polish television. There's also a few intellectuals that start, but this is a debate between intellectuals. It doesn't become like not that this is mainstream per se, but that has like really kind of reverberations, in the real world. That is about Poland's reckoning with the Jewish past, and a lot of people like thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, I'm interviewed many people who said, I live in a town that it turns out was 80% Jewish, and I did not know. How could I have not known, right, and learned this at 25? So this is where it also, so it's less about situating Poland. Poland has a very strong messianic sense and never had any problem thinking it belonged to the West.
I have a question on here on the screen that actually articulates this a bit. How much actual cultural interaction was there between Poles and Jews in those little villages and cities before World War II?
Well, it depends. I mean, if it was 50-50, I mean, they lived in very close spaces, these were tiny villages. So, so a lot actually, but you had some shtetls that were completely 100% or 90% Jewish with just a few non-Jews Gentiles coming in to work to provide some services to the Jewish communities. I mean, Warsaw also, you had different types of Jews. You had people who were completely assimilated, Polish speaking, we're going to Polish universities, like in the liberal profession, that had very little feelings, secular, feelings toward their Jewish identity. And you had people who lived in shtetls who didn't speak Polish and were completely enclosed communities. So there's a very wide range of also politically. You had socialists, you had, you know, Bundists, you had, you know, people who were really Polish nationalists too. So Poland was extremely diverse. When you think it's 3.5 million Jews in Poland before World War II. So some were very integrated into Polish society, some not at all, and most, I don't know, but I would assume that a large number were kind of had their own Jewish lives and Polish lives as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how this kind of cultural phenomenon impacts on politics. And so, is it capitalized? Is there this idea of Jewishness as part of Polishness that come into political discussions? More on the left, I would imagine, and in terms of what it means to be Polish. And then a second question, the way you present it seems very kind of harmonious, and I understand from what you said that there isn't much resistance from the Jewish community itself, but is there any tension in the way that this past is represented, or the way that it is incorporated into a sense of Polishness, other than the kind of other extreme of anti-Semitism?
We have one question that fits with this, and that is this anything more than cosmetic, or are you simply viewing Jews as exotic, almost persons as almost like pets, not integral, worthy members of the citizenry, and this person who her Polish Jewish parents lost most of their families during the Holocaust.
I think it's much more than, I mean, so of course you have that casual, you know, just going to a festival because, or going to a Klezmer club because you like the ambiance. But I think it's much more significant overall. There's not, you know, you can't have like 40 festivals of Jewish culture, you know, half a dozen museums, people learning Yiddish and Hebrew and publishing on that if it's not somewhat more significant than just having fun. And that's been going on for at least 20 years like this, right? So it's also lasting, that popularity and that investment. So that's to respond to the person on Zoom, although I can see, you know, why it can be perceived as such. So the book, I'm trying to show the significance, even though people who are more thoughtful in their engagement have a lot of blind spots, in the way that they romanticize the past, for example. So it's true that the Jewish community sees this, and that's across the board, as a very positive development for themselves in Poland. And in fact, they also participate in some of that. So that Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow, that becomes every year a site where Jews from all over Poland go. They have meetings, they have panels, they celebrate anniversaries, they do all sorts of things there that becomes like a big kind of family event there. They participate in this, they see this as theirs. Polish Jews or Poles who are recovering their Jewish identity also go to these places to slowly reappropriate Jewish culture from which they have been cut off since the Holocaust, right? They're not going to knock on the rabbi's door right away, especially since the rabbis tend to be from an Orthodox. There's now Reform, and there's other, but it's primarily Orthodox rabbis. So how do you reconnect with your Jewishness? They go to the JCC and they go to festivals and then they take classes, and this is how they reconnect. And so for the Jewish community, this is very positive. They're recovering their community and rebuilding their community thanks to many of these cultural events, and also because the cultural events that are so visible in public life makes it attractive to people who find Jewish roots to want to kind of rediscover them, right? So, and that's why some non-Jews are seeking, hoping that they find some Jewish roots. I mean, of course, there's always like the danger that if it has a specific political valence, it could switch to something more negative. But for the Jewish community in itself, it's a positive thing. In terms of the left, the political left has been very involved in basically admitting Polish participation in pogroms. The leftist government of Alexander Kwaśniewski issued a formal apology in, was it 2001, after the publication, and yet Wagner apologized on behalf of Poles to Jews. So I mean, of course, they're much more, around this. Right now, they're trying to get rid of law and justice. Their entire political program is not around cultural issues, it's around the rule of law, and it's about economics. But they support these initiatives.
Fascinating. I have two very specific questions in the on Zoom, but I wondered if we have other questions in the room. Oh, I have a lot of questions in here.
Just
One person. What is your name?
John.
All right, John. And then, do you have a specific or a general question? You said?
I think it's pretty specific.
Okay, why don't you ask it, because I'm specific in this. What I have online here, I would like to get them, but go ahead.
Right,
Yeah.
sure, I'll cover it. So you mentioned that in countries like Germany and Hungary, the sort of like Jewish cultural revival has been more centered around like actual Jews as opposed to non-Jews. Are there other countries in Central or Eastern Europe that have seen like anything comparable to Poland in terms
Well,
of
so
non-Jews?
Ukraine had a sort of Jewish revival. Ukraine had much more, many more Jews than in Poland. I mean, many of them were actually Polish Jews that when the borders changed, they remained. But now, of course, with the war, but even before the war, a lot of the young Jews would leave for Israel because the conditions were difficult. So there has been long, a strong immigration from Ukraine. Russia doesn't need a revival because it had a strong, very large Jewish minority in large cities in Russia. That's going to be interesting to see what happens now, as a lot of Russians, including Jews, are leaving. So I know that the chief rabbi of Russia has actually left Russia. And so that's going to be the political situation in Russia is likely to have a severe impact on Jewish life in Russia. I don't see a Jewish revival in France. You had a Jewish population, Ashkenazi population in France. After, in the 60s, you also had large Jewish community from Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, who moved to France. Some of them are going now to Israel because of anti-Semitism in France. But I think that it's primarily something that you're seeing now in Central Eastern Europe.
Okay, I have two questions here. One, I think it's easily answered, and the other one I need to read from the beginning. So let me just give you the quick one. Somebody just said it's cool to know Jewish culture in Germany. Many Israelis are moving to Germany. That just popped up on the screen. Cool.
Cool.
G-O-O-L.
Cool.
If you have anything, I don't know if you want to bracket that or because I have these two others that I want to get to. But anyway, one is, I think are there any other cultures besides the Jews that are having an impact in expanding Polish culture in general?
So I think that's an important.
Okay, no, I just want to say there's a longer one.
Okay, but that's an important question. There are other minorities around which, and I mentioned Ukrainians. So the book was finished before the war in Ukraine. but Ukrainians were, so the largest minority in Poland, were Silesians actually, but because they have a separate local identity. Visible is the Vietnamese, but in recent years, a lot of Ukrainians, students, about 200,000 Ukrainian students in Poland, many of whom had Polish origins, and they had the Polish card, basically, the equivalent of a green card, but for descendants of Poles, but were, Ukrainian, and many of them were from Western Ukraine, so they speak Ukrainian. But now, if you're walking in Warsaw and Krakow, you hear Russian everywhere. Because these are refugees from Eastern Ukraine, and they're primarily Russian speakers. Ukrainianness is not a category through which Poles could reinvent themselves, because in Polish imagination, Ukrainians are peasants. Because in Galicia, Poles were in cities, Ukrainians were working the land. Jews were also in cities, primarily as traders and in smaller shtetl. So Ukrainianness doesn't have cachet, for example. You would not reconstruct your identity with, and also Poles, because Western Ukraine was part of Poland. Ukraine is considered, less so now, but it was basically a colony. So there's this kind of colonial lens in how they look at Ukrainians. It's possible that now that Ukraine is really fighting for democracy, for justice, for the rule of law, and they're articulating a very strong civic discourse, it could be that, for example, Poles will kind of say, let's be like Ukrainians, let's fight for democracies like Ukrainians are doing. But they are unlikely to do it around cultural forms, because Ukrainian folk culture is considered, folk culture, and it's not something that Poles are. It's not something that has high cultural or symbolic capital. And I mentioned the Silesian, the Kashub, all of those. They don't. This is not how you're building.
I want to get to this was actually the very first question that came in. It's very specific. The person says, I have read the book of Jacob. Would you please contextualize the negative political reception in Poland of the fiction of Olga
Tokarczuk,
a non-Jew? How do you explain her deep understanding of Jewish history in Poland and Ukraine? What motivated her? Is that philosemitism?
So Olga Tokarczuk, who's a Nobel Prize winner of literature from 2018, she would totally fit in some of those Polish liberals, progressive intellectuals who participate in the kind of institutions and projects I talked about. She's also pro-animal rights. She's pro-women's rights. I mean, she's all of these, and these values also come in clusters. So she was attacked by the Polish right for being a feminist and for being critical of the church and for writing about Jewish topics, and especially for saying that Poles had participated in pogroms against Jews, right? So, I mean, she's representing all sorts of things that the right abhor. And so she was persona non grata by a lot of Poles on the right and far right, because she's calling a spade, basically. And that's been very uncomfortable, that she actually gained that visibility on, the world scene. And some people also say that she also, I mean, she's an amazing author, but she also gained that, the prize perhaps because of her engagement with difficult issues in Poland.
Are there any more questions in the room?
There
We
was
have
one
some
here.
time.
I
Where
was
is-
pointing to somebody. Oh, okay.
Oh, I can't see. Who's the person there?
No,
Oh,
his
you
question
didn't
was,
have- oh, I
was
didn't
answered.
have it. You know, I was wondering if I could answer the question, actually. I mean, I went to see many years ago now, probably when you started this project, you recommended an exhibit in New York, but it was really a film that I can't remember.
It's Yael Bartana's trilogy. The first one was Nightmares.
Well, we went into this art museum and there was,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So, and I found it, you know, really kind of puzzling, actually, and I've read your book and it's a wonderful book. And I was thinking, how does one draw a distinction between what's being done in Poland? And I realized there's the paradox of really the whole Jewish community was more or less destroyed. And sort of a kind of culture of reparations that you see going on in some other Eastern European countries. I mean, I've seen some of that in Hungary, some of it recently in the Czech Republic. And I'm trying to sort of fit this all together in my mind. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, I think that communism was really, 50 years of silence around that. And, strong censorship and strong propaganda, not only about this, but about basically everything. But after the fall of communism, there's a bunch of, you have also the opening of archives. So, I mean, for the students here taking Christina's class about Auschwitz, Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army, by Ukrainian divisions, actually. So all of the papers were in Moscow. So it was not until the mid 1990s that the archives were open, that people could go and actually see the paperwork of who was murdered at Auschwitz. And before that, basically, the claims were made, these were political claims, so that the Soviets liked to enlarge the liberation by inflating the numbers. They were saying that there were 4 million people who died at Auschwitz. Right, and it was also implied in the museum that most of these victims were Polish. It was victims of, victims of fascism, and they were the Polish nation and members of 26 other nations. Jews were not mentioned. So it was, World War II was really told in that framework of communism fighting and winning over fascism and capitalism. That was the narrative of World War II. So when you open the Soviet archives and you can establish, first of all, it was not 4 million, but it was 1.2 million, 90% of whom were Jewish victims. And the largest group of Jews who were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau were Hungarian Jews in 1944, when the train tracks were built from the Oświęcim train station to Birkenau. I mean, in Poland, that created, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, like a very big deal. Each nation had their own pavilion, their own exhibit at Auschwitz-Birkenau. A lot of them did not want to revise because they had created those exhibits as something about their resistance to fascism. And then it turns out that actually many of those countries, like Hungary, had sent their own Jews there. Same thing with France. So I think we can't underestimate really how living in a totalitarian system is really shaping silences and shaping basically what people learn and do not learn. And even if this was false, some of these truths were integrated to the extent that when the real truth came out, people were not necessarily happy with that. Same thing, if Poles were portrayed as really the main victims of World War II because 6 million citizens died during the war, 3.5 million Jews, and then the rest Poles and other minorities, to put the 6 million Jews at the center of World War II was really for them like removing something that had been held in as a sacrosanct category. So this is also why like the fall of communism is really shaking things up about history. And a lot of these countries trying to figure out and dealing with the past in different paths. There's the Polish Jewish past, but there's also, you know, a lot of people who were enthusiastic in building socialism, right, across those countries, even though there was strong resistance against the regime. Also, there are all sorts of things that basically people had to kind of wrap their heads around that were uncomfortable. So that's one thing I'm talking about in that article you reference about vodka. I talk about vodka, but it's about the national sensorium and about Polish national mythology, how mythology becomes embedded in narratives and stories, but also in the landscape, in music, TV shows, and things that basically comes to permeate our very beings. Poland has a very strong national sensorium and ways of thinking and feeling the nation that become extremely difficult then to change, because it's embodied. It becomes really in people's, and it's also in people's family histories. If you think in Poland that, you know, there were just a few thousand Jews left, but that 3 million non-Jewish Poles were killed, that they lost territory. Everyone in their family has someone who died in World War II and was in a concentration camp. And you don't have the stories of Jews. You have just the stories of those who survived and told their stories. So it's 3 generations of people who were basically socialized in a specific telling of history. And this is why the Jewish past becomes so important for people who fight for democratic values, who fight for basically having, you know, fight against fake news and want to have basically things in the open in order to build a different kind of society.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank you for this really fascinating talk, and it was really wonderful and insightful, and I hope others. Oops, where is the book? Here it is. Buy the book. Although we were not particularly selling it, but it's a great book and it's a great read and it's wonderful research. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Mabel, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming.